Belsen-Bergen. The larger and smaller concentration camps throughout Germany were divided into two categories. The first category consisted of the work camps, connected with German war industries, where the slave workers were mostly, but not always, Gentiles. The second category was the extermination camps, such as Auschwitz, Dachau, Grossrosa, Dora, Buchenwald, Ravensbrück, and a number of others where organized murder was the only activity. There was, however, a camp in northern Germany between Hamburg and Hanover, which even the SS themselves designated as a dung heap. In Belsen-Bergen there was not a sign of the famous German gift for organization. While in Auschwitz, extermination was regulated by careful planning, here mass dying was a consequence of a lack of planning. In January 1945, at the time of the big Russian counteroffensive, when Russian tanks were swiftly approaching to meet the British and American armies coming from the west and the south, Belsen-Bergen became a dumping ground for prisoners evacuated from all other camps in Nazi-occupied territory. The highways were crowded with endless columns of marching slaves, almost naked in the icy winter, sick and starving, human skeletons driven with whips and guns. Those who were too weak to keep up with the column were brained with gun butts. Dead bodies littered the ditches on both sides of the highway, indicating that other camps had previously been evacuated. Those who were brought to Belsen-Bergen in cattle cars were no better off than those who had to walk. I passed many of those cars on my way to Belsen-Bergen, saw the fleshless hands creeping out through the barred windows, heard the pitiful cries for bread, for water, for air, for death. Often these cars were put off on a side rail and forgotten until they were destroyed when the Allies bombed the stations, or until the stench of decomposing bodies reminded the Nazis of their existence. The rope was tightening around the Nazis' necks, and still, even in those hours of extreme emergency, they took time to drive these unfortunate, helpless creatures towards the north, the Nazi fortress, so that none of them should fall into Allied hands alive. Belsen-Bergen was the terminal. It was supreme fulfillment of sadism and bestiality. Belsen-Bergen can never be described. It cannot be imagined, because even the most pathological mind balks at such a picture. One must have seen those mountains of rotting corpses mixed with filth, with human excrement, where once in a while one noticed a slight movement caused by rats or the death convulsion of a victim who had been thrown on there alive. One must have smelled the unimaginable stench which lay over the camp like a thick cloud shutting out the air. One must have heard the unearthly screams of agony which continued through the day and night, coming from hundreds of throats, unceasingly, unbearingly. In Belsen-Bergen, only a few blocks had cages along the walls. In the others, people were lying on the ground in their own filth, the living, the dying, the dead, all together. There were 80 to 100 dead in each block every day. There were no crematories to burn the bodies. They were left where they had died until someone who had enough strength left to move dragged them out and threw them on the dung heap. Everybody had typhus. Everyone was covered with lice, eaten alive by rats, and there was no food. There was also no water and no medicine. The narrow streets between the blocks were full of skeleton-like men and women who crept around in the dirt, searching for a drop of water, a bite of food, until utterly exhausted, they sat down beside one of the mountains of corpses to die. Those who had enough vitality left to want to live on resorted to cannibalism. They opened the bodies of the recently dead and ate their livers, their hearts, their brains. There was no roll call here, no selection, no work, no order. There was only death, a slow and horrible death from which there was no escape. New and new contingents of victims kept arriving endlessly. At first they refused to believe their own eyes, tried to fight it, tried to survive. One could see them search the corpse mountains for their relatives, friends, acquaintances, breaking into wild sobs whenever they recognized the distorted face of a loved one. A little later they themselves were irrevocably lost in the inferno Belsen-Bergen. I arrived there on March 7th. 1945, and the next day I found the bodies of my brother and my 20-year-old sister-in-law among the dead. Nothing can prove Nazi bestiality better than the fact that even here our jailers, the ex-commander of Auschwitz and his henchmen, walked around clean, perfumed, well-fed, smiling. They had nothing to do. Death did their work for them. Death held the whip. Death called roll call. Death prevented escape, revolt. The commander of this camp was a physician from Brasso, a Dr. Klein, who did everything in his power to prolong our suffering, make our death more horrible, and ruin those who, by some miracle, could have saved their lives. When the day of liberation arrived, April 15th, 1945, I saw British officers and soldiers weep at the sight which unfolded before their eyes. Even the most hardened warriors were crying, vomiting and cursing at this never-imagined depth of human depravity. When after their arrival we opened the warehouses, we found them filled to the brim with food, medicine, serums, bandages that could have saved the lives of the entire camp had we only been permitted to use them. Let no one speak to me of German culture, German civilization. Belsen-Bergen was the faithful portrait of German civilization. Belsen-Bergen mirrored the German soul. General Glenn Hughes. While in Auschwitz, I believed that it was the site of ultimate horror, a place which made Dante's Inferno appear a musical comedy and hell, as described by the Catholic Church, a sinecure. When I arrived in Belsen-Bergen, I discovered that Auschwitz was no more than a purgatory. Hell was enclosed between the barbed wire fences of Belsen-Bergen. In Auschwitz, we still had the strength to keep our past alive and find comfort in reliving our memories. Here, as if our very brains had dried out, no one thought came to our minds, our imagination refused to function, for had it, it dwelled on the sight which opened before our eyes. We would all have gone stark, raving mad. Our conversation was restricted to the essential topics: food, pain, death. Surrounded by mountainous heaps of rotting corpses and by ditches full of bodies, some of which still remained a breath of life, but not the strength to climb out from under their dead companions, stood Block 3, the maternity block of Belsen-Bergen. From concentration camps all over Germany, pregnant women were sent here to bear their children in this torture chamber of hell. There were Germans, Hungarians, Dutch, French, Gypsies, Russians, Polish, Czechoslovakian women lying in the cages along the walls, 2 in each. Their tremendous stomachs, swollen to a bursting point with child and hunger, did not permit them to move, and their moans, their screams, their helpless cursing filled the building with a constant deafening cacophony. Lice covered their bodies in thick layers, hungry, persistent, insufferable lice, sparing nobody, not even the faces and the hands of the doctors. Block 3 was my responsibility, but what can 2 empty hands do to relieve the indescribable suffering of hundreds? Everyone in the block had typhus. As if the disease were bent upon faithfully serving the Nazis, it came to Belsen-Bergen in its most violent, most painful, deadliest form. The diarrhea caused by it became uncontrollable. It flooded the bottom of the cages, dripped through the cracks below, into the faces of the women lying in the cages below, and mixed with their blood, pus, and urine, formed a slimy, fetid mud on the floor of the barracks. Without water, without medicine, without help, every attempt at life-saving seemed futile. And yet the doctor and me never gave up, even when the human being reached the limits of its endurance. I fought on with bare hands, cut my shirt into rags to wipe the hot, moist, soiled faces of my patients, tried to smile at them through the layer of filth that covered my own face, and whispered hoarse, unconvincing words of comfort. The air was so thick and humid that no one could hardly breathe, and the horrible smell of human excrement, blood, pus, and sweat invaded our nostrils in nauseating waves, until the desire for fresh air became just as torturing, just as unbearable as our desire for a mouthful of water. Our eyes hurt from the sight we couldn't escape. Our eardrums hurt with the sounds we couldn't shut out. Burning compassion, helpless pity filled our souls until they hurt like an open wound. I had been working in Block 3 for several weeks when around April 12, 1945, a whirlwind of excitement changed the atmosphere of the camp. Our SS guards left their post, and Hungarian soldiers with white armbands took over the policing of the camp. Something was happening beyond the barbed wire fences, something of great importance of which we were not told, and yet rumors began to travel from mouth to mouth. Wonderful, encouraging rumors, for which the moment seemed louder than the screams of those writhing in birth pains. The Allies are coming! The liberators are coming! Those who had the strength to get up came out of the barracks, and we went from group to group to listen to the news. We are going to be free. We are going to go home. We can be human beings again. We can eat, drink, drink. Only the incorrigible pessimists did not believe in life. They are going to blow up the camp before they go. They are going to kill us first, they moaned. Could the Nazis permit this proof of their bestiality to survive? The camp was seething with joy, fear, uncertainty, hope, and expectancy. April 15th, 1945, young Marusa from Warsaw is about to bring her child into the world. In her superhuman pain, she tears the filthy rags from her body, her dirty hair sticks wet to her pale forehead, and she holds on feverishly to my dirty hands. Help me, doctor, help me. Before having been brought to Belsen-Bergen, Marusa was a member of the underground movement of the partisans in Warsaw. She had done everything a human being could do to fight the Nazis, and then, 8 months ago, she was caught and condemned to rot alive in Belsen-Bergen. The child she carried under her heart grew on the hatred Marusa felt for the Nazis. It grew until April 15th, 1945, when it was ready to leave the typhus-infected, lice-ridden, feverish body of its mother. I did not leave her side even for a moment, although the confused sounds coming from the outside came nearer and nearer. Suddenly I heard trumpets, and immediately afterwards a tremendous shout of joy coming from thousands of throats shook the entire camp. The British have come. The liberators have come. We are free. 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 Marusa's last scream of pain sounded almost jubilant, and a moment later there was between her legs the first free child born in Belsen-Bergen. Pale and exhausted, the young mother could hardly smile, but the words leaving her bloodless lips were like a prayer. Freedom. Freedom. The first free child of Belsen-Bergen was safe. But her mother's blood wouldn't stop flowing. She grew paler and weaker, and wide streams of blood came gushing out of her womb. My heart beat wildly. I had to save this partisan mother. I had to save her. What did I care about freedom, about the British, about anything in the world if I couldn't save this heroic, tortured young mother? I ran out of the barrack and stopped the first British soldier I saw. Water! Get me water and a disinfectant. He didn't understand. I ran on and came face to face with a tall, impressive-looking soldier. With my bloody, dirty hands, I grasped his sleeve. Do you understand French? He nodded. Get me water, please, and some disinfectant. I have to perform an operation. Hurry! Hurry! He looked down on me from his tremendous height, uncomprehending, but moved to the core. He must be an officer, I thought, a soldier who is used to the sight of blood. And already I was pulling him by the sleeve, pulling him toward Block 3. Half an hour later I had the water, the disinfectant, and could wash my hands and perform the operation, not as a helpless prisoner, but as a doctor. Here, in the first hour of liberty, I saved the lives of the partisan woman Marusa and of little Marusa, her daughter. Many weeks later, when the young mother succeeded in overcoming the typhus, they both returned to Warsaw to take part in the rebuilding of their beloved city. The tall, hardened soldier looked on, with tears rolling down his cheeks. He could understand war, yes, and he was not afraid of death. But what he saw in Belsen-Bergen was beyond the limit of his understanding and of his imagination. He did much, but in most cases he was too late. Yet he was a real liberator. All the inmates of Belsen-Bergen who survived will forever bless his name. He was Brigadier General Glenn Hughes, head of the 2nd British Army.